Hi, everybody, and welcome to our second keynote speech of the day. It's my very great honor to introduce Joseph E. Stiglitz, the American economist and professor at Columbia University. He's also co-chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD and the chief economist at the Roosevelt Institute. A recipient of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001, he is a former senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank and a former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. In the year 2000, Stiglitz founded the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, a think tank on international development based at Columbia University. He was named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2011. And his research focuses on income distribution, risk, corporate governance, public policy, macroeconomics, and globalization. His most recent book is People, Power and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent, Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy and the Euro. And Professor Stiglitz is going to speak for 20 minutes, and then we have a number of questions which have already been sent in, but if you do want to add your own questions, do feel free to do so in the comments bar. Welcome, Professor Stiglitz.
Well, thank you, and it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you. What I'm going to discuss is some of the lessons that have emerged around the world, both sides of the Atlantic, from the COVID crisis. And in particular, what we've seen from the COVID crisis about inequality and what we've learned about macroeconomics, about what makes for a good society, a good economy. First, let me begin by talking about inequality. The COVID crisis affects those at the bottom much more than the rest. It has exposed and aggravated the inequalities, as well as exposing the deficiencies in our economic and political systems, in particular systems of social protection. Now, I'm going to talk probably more than you want to hear about the United States, but that's partly because I know it better, but it's also because it illustrates how bad things can go. And it's people in the UK probably want to feel a little bit better. You're having a hard time. We were successful in getting rid of Trump. We had a much worse time, I think, for the last 4 years than you did, but I don't want to have a race to the bottom and what was worse. But what I do want to emphasize is that by seeing what happened in the United States and some other countries, I think we can learn both about what goes wrong and then looking at some of the successful countries, what goes right. When you're discussing COVID-19 and the responses to it, it's natural to begin by talking about health. And this is one area where the deficiencies in the United States have been most marked. The U.S. is the one advanced country that doesn't recognize access to healthcare as a basic human right. And the result of this is there are huge disparities in the health status between those at the top and those at the bottom. It's worth pointing out that it's not only the disparities in health status, it's also the case that the average level of health isn't very good. That today, 2019, before the pandemic, life expectancy in the United States was not only at the bottom of the advanced countries, but was actually lower than it was in, say, 2015. Another aspect that the pandemic exposed is the deficiencies in our systems of social protection. The United States does not have mandatory sick leave. And And that meant that those who were living paycheck to paycheck and came down with COVID-19 had to go to work. And studies in the United States show something like 40% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. They have under $400 in their bank account to meet whatever emergencies they have. Firms were short-sighted. They didn't provide for sick leave. The consequence for our country was that because people went to work, it helped spread the disease. One of the reasons why we've had more than 500,000 Americans die of COVID-19. But it wasn't only that the largest and richest firms in the United States didn't provide sick leave. They actively opposed it. And when Congress recognized that there was a real problem here and wanted to pass legislation giving mandatory sick leave just for COVID-19, just for 10 days, these large firms lobbied successfully against a mandate. And that meant that half the workers in America were exempted from mandatory sick leave. Making matters even worse, and again emphasizing the importance of the role of government, was that it didn't provide the occupational and health standards that were necessary to protect workers and to protect their customers. So the agency responsible, we call it OSHA, asked of COVID-19, and again enhancing the spread of the disease. Finally, we all turn to government when there's a crisis, whether it's a natural disaster or, in this case, a health disaster. But 40 years of neoliberalism, 40 years of an attack by Reagan, by Thatcher against government, has left governments unprepared to address these basic needs of helping protect us when there is an emergency, a crisis like the pandemic. So in the United States, we had one of the best agencies for managing contagious disease, the Centers for Disease Control, CDC. They were instrumental in disseminating the best practices related to managing contagious disease. But in the onslaught by the Republicans, the funding for the Centers for Disease Control was taken away. And they couldn't have targeted worse. They targeted it against those diseases like this virus that originate in animals. So they actually, that was the part that they defunded the most. We had, under Obama, a White House office for preparation for pandemics. It was actually in the National Security Council because we recognized it was a matter of national security. But the Trump administration disbanded that. When we look across the pond, we looked with a great deal of admiration at your National Health Service. And I think it's been widely given credit for your success in the rollout of the vaccine. Let me turn now to a second set of issues that are obviously very important, the macroeconomic issues, and talk a little bit about the comparison of the macroeconomics across different countries. The good news in most countries in the advanced world that we don't need to talk about austerity anymore. In the case of the United States, we follow very much what Draghi did in the case of the European Central Bank. We would do whatever it takes, and our spending is roughly in the order of magnitude of 25% of GDP, most of it deficit financed. We recognized that this was really important in protecting the vulnerable, getting the disease under control, and reviving our economy, and in particular, building back better. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. The result of this massive spending is that it looks very much like the US is going to have the strongest recovery in the world. The downturn was much smaller than in the UK or in Europe, where there wasn't the magnitude of the spending. And let me just mention here, and I'll come back again to this, is that the US programs were not well designed. There were many, many criticisms of them, but the sheer magnitude did serve to protect us. And so Goldman Sachs is projecting an 8% growth for 2021. The Federal Reserve is projecting a 6.5% growth. It looks now that by the end of this year, we will actually be stronger than the projections in 2019 before the pandemic. So that we will not only have recovered, but we will have exceeded the trend that we were on. The poor design in the United States did have consequences. It meant that we had a much higher spike in the level of unemployment. And that in turn, of course, had enormous impacts on suffering of the more vulnerable, levels of anxiety. I think one has to also recognize that while the EU didn't do anything comparable to what the United States did, it did do two things that were markedly different from what it did in the Euro crisis. It abandoned the austerity, and it finally issued Euro bonds. I should add at this point that one of the very disappointing things is that the developing countries and emerging markets don't have the resources to stimulate their economies in the way that the United States or even Europe have done. The result of that is I was just looking at the data this morning, the average stimulus package in the least developed countries is $2 per capita. The United States is something like 8,000 times larger. And making matters worse is that while the IMF has been very, very forceful in arguing on behalf of the developing countries, trying to get them more money, in some of the detail of the programs that they've worked out, there has been a kind of austerity imposed that is of some concern. Again, at the macroeconomic level, one of the big debates going on in the United States now is a worry about inflation. I am not worried. There's a high level of global excess capacity. Workers, unfortunately, have a weak bargaining position. And the employment rate, not the unemployment rate, but the employment rate was very low even before the pandemic, and of course is much lower now. I actually think it would be really good for the United States and for other countries to have tight labor markets. We've seen that the only time that we've really achieved inclusion of groups that have been marginalized, women, minorities, is when we get our unemployment rate really, really low. And if inflation does arise, we have tools. And today, because of new technology, we can monitor the inflation much more accurately, much more in a much more timely way than we could previously. So right now, there are two tools we have. We have monetary policy. I think it would be a good thing if we departed the kind of zero interest rate environment that we've had for the last dozen years. The cost of capital is clearly not zero. The social cost, the scarcity value of capital is not zero. And yet we price it at zero. And that distorts all kinds of aspects of the capital market, including the pricing of risk. Also, a tighter economy would be a good opportunity to restructure our taxes. We have too low average of a tax rate and too regressive of a tax structure. But as long as the economy remains weak, it's very hard to bring in the discussion of redoing our tax structure. But if we have a tight economy, I think one of the things that will be on the agenda will be redoing our taxes. As we talk about taxes, one of the few things that were good about the budget that was presented a couple of weeks ago in the UK is its announcement to increase the corporate tax rate. Hopefully this will signal an end to the race to the bottom that's been going on for so long among the countries around the world. The United States under Trump cut the tax rates here to 21%. And I think there's a strong support of raising them back at least to 25%, maybe beyond that. I'm not worried about raising the corporate income tax, what the effect of that would be on investment. After all, the corporate profits tax is a tax on pure rents, on pure profits. The cost of labor is deducted, the cost of capital is deducted. And so theory and evidence shows that the corporate income tax does not lead to reduced investment. Conversely, when, say, in the United States, we reduced the corporate profits tax from 28% down to 21%, there wasn't a boom in investment. What happened was that there were massive increases in share buybacks and dividends. There are actually an ample set of taxes that can improve economic performance, correctly measured. We need a carbon tax, a windfall tax on the profits that so many companies made during the pandemic, particularly a digital tax, which is creating an unlevel playing field between the bricks and mortar stores and the digital stores. Pricing carbon is an important instrument. It gives a signal to reduce emissions, but it needs to be accompanied by public investment and strong regulations, something I'll hopefully have time to talk about in just a few minutes. So we can celebrate that around the world there has been, the austerity has been pushed aside, but I don't think we should rest on our laurels. We already have seen in the United States a return by the Republicans to fiscal, the rhetoric of fiscal austerity. You know, when they gave a tax cut for the billionaires and for the corporations, the fact that led to trillion-dollar deficits every year didn't bother them at all. But now that we're helping poor people and the vulnerable people and thinking about doing so many other things, changing the structure of our economy, dealing with climate change, suddenly fiscal religion has returned to the Republicans. So I think we shouldn't rest on our laurels. Yes, neoliberalism is not now flourishing, but the battle will be joined once again. As I've said, not only is the size of spending important, but also the design. And that's one aspect that's particularly impressive about the initiative in the United States under President Biden. One of the problems in the earlier initiatives, as I say, they were very big, but they weren't well designed, and they left out states and localities. This is really critical because it's at the local level where there is a lot of responsibility for education, health. These are especially important in pandemic. And austerity at the local level is just as bad as austerity at the national level. In fact, in many ways, it's worse because the local governments typically have no choice. They have to limit their spending to their revenues. Historically, this kind of local austerity has had very strong macroeconomic effects. And it also has very adverse distributive effects. These cutbacks in spending are highly regressive. So in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, we saw this go on a massive scale. Even by 2019 in the United States, we did not get back to the level of employment in state and local governments that we had before the 2008 crisis. And I note that this is part of the conservative government agenda, is to try to squeeze these spending at the local level and make life more difficult there as they champion what they're doing at the national level. Let me just for a minute broaden the discussion. The COVID-19 has been what economists and social scientists call a massive natural experiment. It's affected countries all over the world, but there have been major differences in how different countries have responded, and major differences, obviously, in outcomes, both in terms of the economy, I've talked about that already, but also in terms of the control of the disease. And thus, the pandemic highlights some of the things that have led to associated with success and some of the things associated with failure. So in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, among the failures were countries like the United States, Brazil, countries with authoritarian figures, people who didn't listen to science, who undermined trust, created divisions in their society. Contrast, countries that have done very well are countries like New Zealand, South Korea. Those were countries where they recognized the importance of externalities, that what one individual does affects others, just like is the case in climate change. They recognize the importance of science, investing in science and listening to the advice of science. They recognize the importance of trust, honesty, dealing with disinformation, which has become a global problem as a result of the social media. Finally, one of the most important differences across countries and within the United States, one of the most important differences between Biden and what happened in Trump is in the case of the Biden plan, case of Europe, there is a vision of the future, what has been called building back better. Recognizing that we don't want to go back to the world that we had in January 2020. That was a world that wasn't dealing with the problem of climate change, that was marked by too much inequality, and as I began my remarks, an inequality that was exposed and aggravated by the pandemic itself. all over the world, countries are recognizing the need to spend massive amounts of money. And as the public spends these massive amounts of money, it rightly should ask, as the public collectively spends that money, shouldn't that money be used to restructure our society, our economy in ways that comport with our values and get to build back better? Of course, money resources are scarce, and that means the spending will have to do double, triple, quadruple duty. It will not only have to rescue the economy, it will have to help make the transition to a green economy, a structural transformation to a more knowledge-based economy. It will have to help create a more equal society. The good news is that much of our research has shown that there are an ample set of projects that actually do all of these things, that can be timely, that can have a big bang for the buck, that can have high multipliers, and that can address all of these needs of our society. So let me just conclude here. We are at a defining moment in our history, history of the advanced countries more generally, and much of the rest of the world. 40 years after neoliberalism had a triumph with Reagan and Thatcher, the COVID-19 trauma, I hope, has brought an end to what should have clearly, even before the COVID-19, be viewed as a failed experiment. We have now seen what kinds of things can help make for a successful society, a successful economy. And our challenge is now to build back better on the basis of the lessons that we've learned from this very painful experience of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you. So that was fascinating. Thank you. Now, I have questions from the people sent in beforehand. I'm also still watching the comment section down the side, so do put in any questions that you want asked, and I'll get through as many as I can. We've got a hard finish at 10 to 4, by the way. Firstly, actually sticking in the US, Marcus Johns has asked, in 2012, you ended The Price of Inequality with the words, "Today that hope is flickering," and wants to know, does the Biden administration's $1.9 trillion recovery package give you that cause for hope? And I'd love to hear what you think of that and how it ties in with what you were just saying about money doing 3 or 4 jobs. Is this money going to do those 3 or 4 jobs?
Well, the Biden plan has been, to me, really a source of optimism. In that rescue plan, he had a lot of money going to not only help the most vulnerable in terms of the COVID-19, the unemployed, the lower income individuals, he also directed an enormous amount of money to children. And it is estimated, some of my colleagues here at Columbia, that the impact will reduce childhood poverty by something like 40 to 50% in 1 year. Now, that is a dramatic. But as always in politics, there's something else that, balancing this optimism of what one can do so quickly and so forcefully is the fact that not one Republican supported this dramatic change. Yeah. And so it exposed the polarity in American politics, and the fact that even though, after the bill was passed, Republicans were championing how good it was. Party discipline made them vote against it.
Mike O'Neill has a follow-up question to that, which is that if recovery packages such as this are not accompanied by higher taxation on wealth and corporate tax, they will tend to increase inequality between the rich and poor. Is that the case? And do you foresee higher taxes down the line?
Well, first, as I said, a strong package like this $1.9 trillion will get unemployment down.
Right.
And that itself will reduce inequality. Getting the marginalized groups into the labor force is extraordinarily important for addressing the problems of inequality. Secondly, in contrast to the 2008, what we did in 2008, when we put the burden on monetary policy, that increased inequality. The reason it increased inequality is that lowering interest rates led to the price of equities going up. Who owns the equities? It's the people at the top.
Yeah.
So wealth inequality increases when you put the burden of adjustment on monetary policy.
Right, okay.
So that was also an important part. Now, there was a deliberate decision in the Biden administration to divide what he wants to do into two packages, or maybe even more. The first package is this rescue package that I just described, a lot of focus on dealing with inequality through, childhood poverty, things that he cares about a lot. The second part is infrastructure, the broader Build Back Better.
Yeah.
And that most people are expecting will have more what we call pay for. In other words, it'll be another maybe a couple of $1 trillion over 10 years, but we'll have an increase in taxes.
Mm-hmm.
The view is that it's very hard, as I mentioned in my talk, to talk about increases of taxes when the economy is weak. But if we succeed in getting growth of 6.5% to 8% by the end of the year, then the economy will be able to withstand that increase in taxes. And it's very clear the nature of those taxes. It'll be particularly increase of taxes on the corporations, increase in taxes on the billionaires, on digital tax, windfall tax. So I think there's lots of room for correcting the regressivity in our tax structure. A lot of people want to impose a wealth tax. Administratively, it may be easier to eliminate the special provisions that are given to capital gains, which benefit mostly people at the top, the special provisions on dividends, the loopholes, the magnitude of tax evasion by the businesses, and so forth.
I've got a question from Abby Berinsky, which I think probably a lot of us would ask and a bit too shy. But it's that if central banks can just buy government securities or undertake QE or give helicopter money out in the circumstances such as the ones we're facing right now, why don't they do that more often? Why did we live through that decade of austerity? Why wasn't this solution tested before? And what is the downside?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. I would have liked us to have done more of this, but in response to the 2008-9 crisis. I think one of the reasons where we're doing it now is that there is finally a consensus that we did too little in 2008-9. Mm-hmm. And that in 2008-9, I and a lot of other people said the Obama stimulus was much too small, and that We needed to help the states and localities. We needed to have more automatic stabilizers to help, to keep money flowing as long as it was needed. And that's why it took so long to get back to where we were before the 2008 crisis. So that's been part of the reason that there's been a change now. I think the other reason is that the economics profession has changed, and some of the people who were the deficit hawks have now said, well, in this low interest environment, you can borrow a lot more. Cost of servicing it is very low. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the deficit fetishism has at least diminished. I've written that you can't count on interest rates remaining low. You have to hedge your bets, but it's certainly the cost of servicing the debt is obviously very low when interest rates are so low as they've been.
Yeah. So the next question is in two parts. Mary Caldor would like to know how the recovery plan affects climate change and how those agendas could feed in with each other. And Tim Shand asks something a bit more conceptual about how we move away from GDP as the definition of progress and how we move beyond economic indicators alone to measure how it's going on the planet. So you can take those in either order or meld them together.
Yeah, let me take them in a little bit separately and begin with the second one. I co-chaired this a series of commissions, OECD expert panel on the measurement of economic performance and social progress. And one of the things we highlighted, not a new idea, but that GDP is not a good measure of well-being. And it's a measure of the market economy, but that doesn't deal with the issue of health of individuals, the health of our planet, the degree of inequality in our society, and we argue, or even the sustainability of our economy. So we argued that you need a dashboard, and you need a dashboard that provides you information about all these different dimensions of our society, of our economy. The economy is just too complex. Our society is too complex to be summarized by any one number. GDP may have some information that's relevant, but one has to use it very, very carefully. So remind me what the first part of the question was again.
So the first part of the question was the recovery, and to the extent to which the recovery plan will and can and should be shaped by the climate change agenda.
Sure. Yeah. So rhetorically, Europe has been much more advanced on this than the United States. They talked about the green recovery. The money actually hasn't been flowing very fast for the green recovery. In fact, they're being a little slow about that. As I mentioned just a minute ago, Biden has decided to have two different packages. The first being the recovery, and then the second will be more green. It's the green infrastructure. It's part of this building back better, and I think it was a strategic decision about how do you get it through Congress, how do you get build up support. As you know, we have just 50 of the votes in the Senate, and you need 50 votes. So we have to get every one of the Democrats on board. And there are we don't have the party discipline that you often have in the UK. And we have some conservative senators. So managing this politics is very difficult. And I think it was easier to say we can get everybody on board on the recovery. One of the key senators, the most conservative, is from a coal state.
Right.
And it's going to have to be very careful navigation of green to get a majority through Congress. I think they'll be able to do it. I'm hopeful they'll be able to do it because you can. It will be. Everybody recognizes how important it is for us to address our infrastructure deficits. They're so large. And as we do that, we will, it makes so much sense to focus on the future, which is to make it a green infrastructure. And we have a lot of selling to do to persuade people that you actually create more jobs as you make the green transition.
Yeah.
It's a sensitive issue, but there are only about 50,000 coal miners, and we already have 3 to 5 times the number of people engaged in installing solar panels.
Yeah.
So the jobs in the green economy are just a multitude of those in the brown economy. So it makes sense, but the particular individuals who are losing their jobs feel quite strongly about it, and the represent them very influential.
Yeah. I mean, to stick on the green recovery and a recovery generally, Omar Salem asks, how do you build a good jobs recovery and a long-term economy? Are these agendas basically indivisible? You build, and you were talking about building back jobs, which kind of reorientated towards the knowledge economy. But are you effectively saying you need to, or your jobs creation needs to dovetail with either green energy or green infrastructure or, a green overhaul of some sort? There's no point rebuilding jobs without rebuilding them in a greener way.
That's right. But there are many other dimensions of building back better.
Okay.
And part of it is, as I say, the knowledge economy I referred to. One of the things that's very big in the Biden plan is the caring economy. That we care about our aged, we care about the sick. The pandemic made that very clear. Care about children. And what we've recognized is that we've underinvested in this caring economy. And one aspect of that is that wages in the caring economy are low.
Yeah.
And those wages are not set by abstract market forces. They are a reflection of our values. Many of those jobs, large proportions, are determined by decisions of government about how much to spend for the caring economy. And one of the reasons that the wages are low is it's a legacy of discrimination, both racial and gender discrimination. And if we didn't have that discrimination, wages would be higher. And that would mean to provide for those jobs, we'll have to spend more. Well, we're rich economies. We can't afford it. It has to, we have to make choices, but it seems that this is a good choice to make, of reallocating more resources to the things that we value. And that's really, you're talking about optimism. The fact that we are beginning to have this discussion is what it is that we value, we care about, and then how do we get to that kind of society? Yeah.
I'm going to ask the next question as the penultimate one, because I suspect it will have rather an unsettling answer. Adam Alnut asks, with the fall of Greensill Capital last week, are you worried about a repeat of 2008? I mean, how likely do you think there's a kind of big financial shock or a big financial event?
I'm not very worried. but economists are always economics called the dismal science for good reason, and we worry a lot about everything. I'm a little bit more worried about, you might say, the medium term, where I worry about the risk imposed by the failure of markets to adequately incorporate carbon risk.
Yeah.
In other words, we know that the market has not adequately incorporated the reality of climate change.
Yeah.
And we can calculate, there's a commitment in the United States now, in Europe, UK, of going to carbon neutrality by 2050, China by 2060.
Yeah.
Now, what does that mean? That means that there are going to be a lot of what we call stranded assets. The value of fossil fuel assets will plummet. And that has not been taken into account. It's just 30 years from now. That has not been taken into account by markets. And we saw what happened in 2008 when we had created a lot of mortgages that were mispriced. And when the price of those mortgages came down, it caused a trauma. And that was only $400 billion or so of subprime mortgages. Now, you ask, how much fossil fuel assets do we have? And it's a huge amount, trillions. And they are embedded, interlinked with with our financial institutions, with so much of our economy. So that's why central banks have gotten together, the responsible central banks gotten together and say, we have to begin to assess better climate risk. We have to get better at forcing companies to disclose their climate risk. And that's the only way we're going to manage this climate risk. So to me, there's always going to be companies that, like Greensill, that there are always things like that. There's going to be a few more as interest rates rise. A lot of people have been depending on cheap capital. And when those interest rates rise, there will be some trauma in the economy. I think we can expect that. But that I hope will not, we will be able to manage that reasonably well. The thing that worries me right now is more the climate risk.
Just one final question, because I know everybody has next sessions in this busy world of the left-wing intellectual. What do you envisage economic recovery as being? Countries learning to live with COVID, or do countries need to have a zero COVID approach if they want to recover?
Well, I think that the vaccines look like they will make a major difference, provided there isn't a mutation. So if the vaccine are as effective as they seem at this juncture, the overall incidence of the disease will go down. If everybody got vaccinated, it would become like a flu. It probably won't go away, but the cases will be manageable, and people won't be hospitalized. There are two concerns I have. One is how rapidly we're going to be able to get this to the developing countries. There's been a lot of vaccine nationalism. The rollout to developing countries and emerging markets has been slow. And secondly, I worry about the anti-vax movement. A very large fraction of the Republicans, particularly Republican men, do say that they are not interested in getting vaccinated. The culture wars, unfortunately, have not only destroyed our politics, they may result in a certain level of the disease persisting in our country. And that will be very disturbing, because that will mean that even the vaccinated people will have to be very careful, because the vaccines are never 100% effective. Nobody wants to come down with even a case of COVID-19, even if they don't have to go on a ventilator. It's better that you don't have to go to hospital, but rather not. So this is, as I mentioned in my talk, a real example of an externality. And it's very clear where the United States is going to be going under Biden. If you want to go to school, if you want to interact in the public sphere, you will have to be vaccinated. And so we will use the instruments we have to induce more vaccination than otherwise would be the case. And I think you have to do that because it's a public health issue.
Thank you, and thank you for all your insights. I'm sorry that we don't have more time, everybody, but we simply don't. It was really fascinating, and I hope in all your hopeful bits that you're right.
I hope so. I hope so.
Thanks to everybody in the audience for some brilliant questions.